Indeed. Okay. So let's go pick up where we left off, shall we? We're looking at properties of water. And we left off kind of at the beginning. And so we, so there's something that I want to do because I didn't add it yet, and I want to drop it in here. I'm going to drop it maybe right about there. I'm going to just add a slide. So I like to make extra notes, and there's not enough room on the PowerPoints to do that. By the way, just by way of announcement purposes, if you're looking at the schedule, it looks like we are, no, we already did that one. Due for an exam next week, which will happen on Thursday. So exams always happen on the last day of the week. The cutoff for that will be determined on Tuesday, as in not this today, Tuesday, but next Tuesday. So wherever that gets cut off. So we'll talk more about that. Okay, so basically I like to sort of put all properties of water in one place so that you're going to have an easy place to go to. Yeah, that's it. So yeah, chapter 1 and chapter 2. So those typically are due, and there's actually one for each chapter, generally speaking. And usually due date wise, I will usually put those like during the exam cycles. And they kind of slide around a little bit depending on where we are. For the first exam, which would be like next week, we should be on target for those two. Because we'll be pretty close to finishing up chapter 2 next week, correct? Next Thursday. That's going to be exam 1. That's week 5. Usually we have a week 4, but I allowed an extra week to make sure we kind of get the usual chapters we covered on exam 1 under our belt. So those are on there. Those due dates, by the way, they kind of slide around. I'll likely probably move them back a little bit. Because I want you guys to have enough time to sort of process the information and just sort of study through the issue, using those to do that with, as opposed to just sort of scampering around hurriedly trying to make due dates, all the while not really doing what you feel like you need to do in terms of your own study process. Okay, so I want to make sure I don't cannibalize your time that way. The lab quizzes, you mean?
No. On the D2L.
Yeah. Those are like chapter, you can think of those more like homeworks. That's kind of more what they're like. So in some sections, they use those as like true quizzes. I tend to just sort of use them more and deploy them more as kind of like a homework sort of a thing. And that's just to give you an idea of what's going on, just kind of get a feel for questions and how they're phrasing and things like that. But a lot of times students do, like if you want more like test questions, not test questions, but like practice questions and things like that, in the OpenStack section, they actually have a lot of resources. I would suggest that you make hearty use of those. Remember, that's always my first question whenever you approach me and say, so my grade wasn't as good as I wanted to be. Okay, so did you make use of your resources, right? I mean, you've got all this fruit hanging down in your face. Did you pick any of it, right? So it doesn't really help to say you're hungry if you're not eating the food that's right in front of you, right? That doesn't make any sense. So there's like, review questions on there. There's like critical thinking questions. Those are really great, right? So there's a lot of questions you can sort of unpack. And the point of that is for you to do those. And then when you find a soft spot to sort of go back and sort of fill that back in, to kind of go back into the material and say like, okay, this is the soft spot, I need to shore this up. And then ideally, if that fails, then of course, then you'd be like, okay, wait a minute, I cannot figure this one out. What's going on here, right? So that's kind of a conversation starter, not just for between you and I, but also between each other. Okay, so that's kind of what that's intended to be used for. Okay, that makes sense. So the quiz thing is just more of like an official version of that. Okay. So that's that. Any other questions? I'm sure you'll probably have more questions next week as we get a little closer to the exam. Also, make sure that you're making use of the lecture videos. If you need to go back and take a look at that. And remember, a lot of times students are like, oh, well, I don't have time to look at all that. Well, you don't have to look at all of it. I mean, just the reason why it's on YouTube is so you can like fast forward to the areas that you need and fill those in, not to just relive the entire semester twice or three times, right? So that's the reason why that's like that. So any other questions? You'll have some. Now, as they come up, just let me know, and then we'll kind of knock them down one at a time. Okay. How about properties of water? Yes, Crystal. So the office hours that I have, actually, they've been getting pretty busy, which is kind of cool. So Mondays from 11 to 1 and Thursdays from 11 to 1 or whenever. So like if you have other times during the week, I've got other areas as well. So we can compare schedules and say like, well, these aren't good times for me, but I do have time here or there, or whatever. So, and we could usually make something work. So, any other questions? Okay, by the way, big strategy, especially like in biology, and for those of you going on to AMP, do yourself a favor. Don't lone wolf it. Right? Make friends, build groups. There's strength in numbers. That's true. Right? A lot of times good students be like, I don't need a study group. Yeah, you do. Yeah, because you don't know it as well as you think. And not only that, but guess what? If you are a strong student and you feel like you're kind of teaching it out to other students who are still struggling with it, what you don't realize is that you're actually learning it better. It is true. If you want to learn something, teach it, because you have to own it if you're going to be able to teach it. And so study groups actually help all students, good, bad, everything in between. So make use of that. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at properties of water. So a couple of things, first of all, that I want to talk about. The last thing we talked about was the structure of water, right? We talked a little bit about hydrogen bonding. We talked about how it's a polar molecule, right? So it's kind of got that negative oxygen on it, and it's got that positive hydrogen, and that's because of the electronegativity differences. So we talked a little bit about that. And when you take a look at the actual structure of water itself, like water, like just a lake or just water in your glass that you're drinking, it looks something like this, right? So basically what you have is this network of water molecules that are all kind of held together by hydrogen bonds. Now, the waters really like each other, right? And so that means that these hydrogen bonds that are holding them together creates a very strong sense of like, okay, I want to hang out with my fellow water molecules. And that's a very strong compunction for water. What that does is, by the way, the hydrogen bonds of water is a very simple molecule, right? Just 3 atoms, polar molecule makes hydrogen bonds. That's it. But that's sufficient to pretty much give us everything that we're about ready to learn. And the important thing about what we're about ready to learn is not necessarily, oh, gee whiz, isn't that cool, the chemical properties of water. I don't really care. The answer is yes, you do care, because if you don't, you're dead. Right? So what we want to do is not just say that here's the properties of water. What we want to do is we want to basically say, okay, here's the properties of water, but what does it give us? Right? Remember, the whole point here is to build a biological organism. So how does this actually add value to our project, which is to build biological organisms and ultimately to build diversity like we learned about from the beginning in the first chapter. So the first three properties are somewhat related to each other, and I tend to lump them together. So we take a look at cohesion, adhesion, and surface tension. And so I'm going to go and define these. So cohesion is basically the attraction of water for itself. Adhesion can be thought of as the attraction of water for a hard surface. And surface tension is the force required to overcome cohesion and break the surface of water. So these are all related. How? By the structure of water. So the force, the attraction of water for itself, right? These hydrogen bonds that water is making with itself causes water to have a very strong tendency to zipper up with each other. That attractiveness to water to itself is cohesion. Okay, now that has some consequences to it. Force? This one? Yeah, force. That is a overly hurried O. It's like half an O. Yeah, that's usually happens when my brain moves faster than my hand, which is most of the time. Surface tension is the force required to overcome cohesion and break the surface of water. To overcome cohesion and break the surface of water. I know. That's going to be the first comment on the evaluations. Dude, handwriting sucks. The problem is that goes nowhere because a person does not change their handwriting because it's not about neatness, it's about psychology. So it's like basically telling somebody to take their brain out and put in somebody else's brain. So handwriting is actually not, there's a reason why we can do handwriting analysis, is because it's an extension of our brain. It doesn't have anything to do with neatness or control or anything like that. And by the way, this is the legible version. So just if you're wondering, it doesn't go downhill from here. I mean, it doesn't go uphill from here, it goes down actually. This is the good version. Trust me, I've tried. The only time it's been really legible is when I broke my right arm and I had to write with my left. So it took me forever and I wrote like a third grader, actually like a kindergartner. The students loved it, but we didn't get anything accomplished. But anyway, okay, so let's take a look at this, right? So we have cohesion. So remember, cohesion is the attractiveness of water for itself. So what's the consequences of cohesion? Well, if water is attracted to itself to a high degree, then what that basically means is that you're going to have to do some things if you want to overcome that relationship, right? So here's a good example. Here's our water strider that we have here. So you can see this guy, and there's lots of other insects you see at the surface of water, just kind of skittering along the surface of the water. And so the question is, how come the water strider doesn't sink, right? Like everybody else. Well, the reason is because there's not enough downward force in the water strider to overcome that surface tension. So the gravitational pull on the water strider's mass, which, by the way, which is a definition of weight, right, does not create enough downward force to overcome the cohesional forces that water has with itself. So here, the cohesion is greater than your downward force. And if that's true, then you will not break that surface tension. You will skitter across the top. Now, us, for instance, it's a different story, right? If we were to land on this pond, we would go right to the bottom. Why? Because we have greater mass under control of gravity, which gives us greater downward force, which is more than the cohesive forces of water. And so we overcome those cohesive forces of water, and then we sink. It's not because the water wants to break, it doesn't, but it's forced to because we have greater force than that. So if you don't have enough force to overcome the cohesion, then you will do exactly what this guy does, walk on water. Okay. And that's surface tension. So surface tension is basically you trying to overcome the force of the cohesive attraction between these water molecules itself. Now, what does this give us? Just this right here. You can already see it, what it gives you, right? The water strider gets to live another day instead of drown. That's a good thing. But what it also gives us is biologically, it gives us an entire ecosystem, right? Think about it. Underneath this water is an entire ecosystem. Fish, plants, any other things that are submerged, right? There's an entire world going on underneath this. By the way, there's an entire world going on above this as well. Okay, that's our world. But a lot of times, if you take a look at a very quiet pond, just focus on what's happening on the surface of the water. There's a lot going on there. There's all sorts of things going on there. So what this does for you then is it creates another zone or a layer where living things can live out their life. This little guy right here probably spends the majority of his life right here at the interface of water and air. But he can only do that because of the surface tension of water, which we get because of hydrogen bonds between the water molecules. So that creates entire habitats. Now, what about adhesion? So with adhesion, what I want to do is I want to give you a couple of examples. So the one we have here certainly is kind of the most clinical, the most, educated one, I guess. It's making use of what's called capillary tubes. Has anybody ever used a capillary tube? Sometimes in clinical settings, you'll use it to draw blood with. For instance, if you, a lot of times, those like little finger stick monitoring systems that you have, they have all sorts of things out for glucose, for cholesterol even, right? So for A1C, you can get all sorts of tests. But a lot of times what they'll have is they'll have like a little narrow channel, and you just kind of put your little blood drop in that little narrow channel, and the blood just kind of sucks up into that little narrow channel. That's capillary. That's the same physics as what we're talking about here, okay? Sometimes when you do a blood draw, you only need like a very small sample to load into a machine for blood analysis. And so sometimes the nurse, you'll come out with like a little capillary tube, lance your finger, and then it'll just suck the blood up in the little capillary tube. That is basically a dance between adhesion and cohesion. So when you take a look at a capillary tube, all it is typically is a glass tube of varying diameters, generally speaking, very small. And so you have a tube with a diameter, and then you have your water column, which will basically be inside the tube. It'll look something like this. So notice how I drew the water, right? Why didn't I draw it straight across? Because of adhesion, right? Because it has a meniscus to it. And of course, by the way, just for lab purposes, whenever you read a volume, you always read the bottom of the meniscus, not the top. But here's what's happening in this. This is what's happening in the capillary tube, by the way. When you put the capillary tube in there, remember, all these water molecules are held together by cohesion, right? So it's like this big chain of waters all connected to each other. Well, here's what happens. let's say I'm a water molecule and I'm hanging on to all you guys, and you guys are all hanging on to each other. And so we're all connected, right? So we're all connected with our hydrogen bonds. Now, the second that I actually feel, and I don't want to lean against this because I'm afraid it's paint, I'll come over the blue back, but usually I do. Right. So basically, when I feel the glass for the first time, then what happens is I'm now interacting with two different forces: cohesion between you guys, right? But now adhesion, because now I'm feeling the glass. So I've got an attraction to the hard surface now too. Okay. So what that means is, what I do is I get stuck against the glass, like smeared against the glass. Now, when I do that, when I kind of splay myself out against the glass, I'm still connected to you guys. I don't let go of you guys. So if I'm getting smeared against the hard glass surface, then what am I doing to you guys? I'm pulling on you guys, right? I'm tugging on you guys. And so whoever I'm connected to, I'm pulling toward me as I'm getting smeared to the glass, which means I'm pulling them toward the glass as well. And so they'll feel the adhesion forces, and then they'll get smeared against the glass, and they'll pull on who they're attached to. And then they'll get smeared against the glass, and they'll pull on who they're attached to. So what you have, if you have yourself in like a little cylinder, basically it's an upward force, right? So I'm kind of like leaning over, hanging on to you guys in the water column. I feel the adhesion on my back. So I get smeared against the glass, and I'm pulling you guys up, which means you guys will feel the glass. And so you'll get smeared against the glass, and you'll pull the folks that you're pulled up. And then they'll get smeared against the glass, and they'll continue to pull those people up. And so what happens is the water column itself is moving upwards. Why? Because the water molecules that are smeared against the glass are pulling on the water column, like you're kind of pulling it up through the column itself. Now, as it turns out, diameter has a lot to say for this, right? So for instance, the larger diameter has the lower level, the smaller diameter has the higher level. Why? Because in a smaller diameter, you have more contact with the glass. So if we are in this room, a large diameter capillary tube, and we're all interconnected, I get smeared a bit against the glass. The folks that are attached to me will feel that, right? So that'll pull them up. By the way, that's what's happening with the meniscus. The water molecules are getting smeared against the glass, and you get a little bit of a pull up of the water column. But guess what? The center is not, is it? This is basically too far away from the glass. So it doesn't feel the same tug as somebody close by. So in a large room like this, those who are immediately attached to me will feel the tug, and we'll kind of rise up. But those who are in the middle, a little ways away from us, won't feel anything at all. So they don't go anywhere, right? That's the reason why you have low volume with a high diameter capillary tube. Think of like a straw, by the way. The same thing's happening when you have like a straw and you're drinking the drink. It's just that the straw is such a big diameter that you don't really see the creep up of the fluid. If you look very closely, you can see it, but it's not a lot. Now, if it's a narrow diameter, this is kind of like us maybe getting into a phone booth, right? So if we're all together, and this is a very narrow, we're all surrounded by glass, that means I'm getting smeared up against the glass, you're getting smeared up against the glass, we're all feeling the glass, and everybody that we're attached to is feeling it as well. So everybody in that tube is feeling the glass because the glass is everywhere around you. And so you're feeling a very strong adhesive presence, and you're feeling that pull up of the liquid as it goes upwards. This is something called capillary action. Okay, that's nice. But again, why do we care? I'm going to give you two reasons why we care. Two applications, one biological, one not. Let's start off with the one that is not. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to take a windshield, two of them. I'm going to do an experiment. With one of these, I'm going to add Rain-X, and the other one, no Rain-X. It's my control. Anybody know what Rain-X is? Yeah, right. So it's a brand name is what it is. It's basically designed to keep water from sticking to your windshield. It's actually quite effective. And so there's probably a lot of, Rain-X is pretty expensive actually. So there's probably a lot of knockoff, non-brand situations. But Rain-X basically will allow your water to sheet off. Now let's go ahead and take a raindrop. And we are going to drop it on the non-Rain-X treated windshield. Now, here's the question. First of all, why is the raindrop that we have oblong? Why isn't it perfectly spherical? Think about it. Has anybody watched an astronaut play with water in space? Yeah, it's like perfectly spherical, right? It looks like a little droplet of mercury almost, right? And it's like perfectly spherical. Well, why doesn't it look that way on the planet? Right? Because it's elongated because of the force of gravity pulling on the drop. Now, when you take a look at the spherical nature of water, that is spherical. The reason why water doesn't fly apart is because of cohesion. So without any outside force or interference, the cohesive properties of water will create a perfect sphere. It's only like gravity that elongates it, but still it's held together, right? So it's just kind of distorted. But what you have here is the rain droplet holds together with cohesion. Okay, now let's let it drop on the windshield. It drops on the windshield, then what happens? It spreads out, right? Why? Because the water is feeling the surface of the glass, adhesion. So at this particular point, adhesion is greater than cohesion. So it smears onto the glass and it smears everywhere, which is the reason why we need windshield wipers, right? Because then pretty soon, after a little while, we have a nice even film of water on our windshield. That's because of adhesion. So what does Rain-X do then? Let's go ahead and treat it. We're going to take another raindrop, very similar. And what happens when Rain-X hits the windshield? I mean, when the water hits the Rain-X windshield. Yeah, right? So if it's kind of cool, actually. It's a lot of fun to watch it. Rainstorms are a lot of fun when you have Rain-X in the windshield. Right, so what does it look like when it hits the windshield? Yeah, it's like a little bead, right? So notice what it looks like. Perfect sphere. It's cohesion holding it together. Is there any adhesion going on here? No, it's almost like the water droplet is like trying to jump off the windshield. It's like it's rearing up, right? So in this particular case, what we have is cohesion is greater than adhesion. So, and it's actually quite nice because it's like it just sheets off. You don't even have to turn the windshield wipers on. I mean, it's just like just rolls right off. It's not a problem at all. So it depends, you know, that's always, if you have to like use your streaky windshield wipers, take a look at Rain-X. It might be a little cheaper depending on what kind of windshield wipers you want to get on there, right? Just add some Rain-X in there and don't ever have to use those windshield wipers again, right? That's one thing, by the way, I hate, of all the things I hate spending money on a car is freaking windshield wipers. I hate that. It's like, oh, your windshield wipers are streaky. Yeah, so I can hang my head out the window. I mean, honestly, you know, it's like, I'm sorry, but you know, it's never going to get bad enough to where you can't see the car in front of you. I mean, if that gets that bad, you probably shouldn't be driving in the first place. I mean, it's like, what, you miss the dump truck in front of you? I mean, how much bigger does it have to be? Right? I mean, seriously, I'm just saying. That's it's always my pet peeve, right? Because it's like, you do realize that cars are big enough to see even through a rainy windshield, right? I mean, lights. I mean, we have lights on there too. I mean, so it's like, I don't know. Anyway. That's that. So now that's great, right? So now we're all going to run out and get Rain-X. Yeah, no, I should have like a Rain-X shirt on there, right? So buy some stock and like buy Rain-X. Little commercial. But that's great. That's cute, right? But now where's the biological application, right? So why do we care? Here's why we care. Let's take a look at this one. What is this? It is, right? We're not talking about any pine tree. We're not talking about the scrawny, scrubby little things that we have in this state. Okay. Or in anywhere in the Midwest. We're talking about the big boys. We're talking about, this is you right there. We're talking about the ones you can drive cars through, right? And they're happy. That's what kills me. It's like, wait a minute. So we just drove through a living tree. This is like crazy, right? That's pretty big. If you've ever seen that one, that's always fun. If you ever had a chance to do that in California, do it. It's always a lot of fun. It's like you can say, you know, I drove through a tree, right? Not into a tree, through a tree. Good. Yeah, the redwoods. So there's a couple of them, right? You have the Sequoia National Park, which has the giant sequoias in there. That's a little further south from the redwoods. The redwoods are up northwest California, right in that little corner near the Oregon border. That's where the redwood forest is. But those are some pretty big. Yeah, those are huge ones. Those are the ones we drive cars through. The sequoias are pretty big too, but they're further down in the Sierra. So, but the redwoods are the ones I'm thinking of. Right. So how tall are those things? It's more like 200. Yeah, they're big. They're bigger than big, right? I mean, the things we have are probably 50 to 100. These things get up into the hundreds of feet up there. Now think about that for a second. They need to get water up here, don't they? And it's like way up there, right? Question? Yeah. So how does it get up there? Do they have a heart? Pump it up there? They have roots, yep. Soaking up all that water. So the water goes into the roots and then where? Okay, but how does it get up the tree? Yeah, so basically trees make use of this exact same principle. Remember we said the diameter is key in how far you can move something up. Well, inside these big pine trees, redwoods in this particular case, the vascular tissue of a redwood is made up of little microscopic tubes, very similar to capillaries, called tracheids. And if you think about it, if you have a small diameter glass tube that's able to get fluid coming up, imagine how much further you can get it if it's a microscopic diameter, a super tiny diameter, and you've got a lot of them. And so that force of that capillary action basically is sufficient to suck the water up through these little tiny capillary-like tracheid vascular tissue all the way up to the crown of the tree. Oh, but wait, it gets better. Because if you take a look at the full story of plant physiology, is up here, the water is evaporating. It's called evapotranspiration, right? That's what all plants do. That's the reason why greenhouses are all steamy, even if you don't have the steamer going and the mister going, right? It's because you got all that evapotranspiration in there. Well, guess what that does? That actually creates more motive force for the column of water to move up. Right? Because it's like this. Let's say we're at the crown of the tree and I'm a water molecule and you guys are still in the column. It's my turn to evaporate. So what happens is I disconnect from you guys. I'm like, bye. I'm out in the atmosphere to go become a raindrop again, right? But what happens is you guys, I think I just leaned against that. Am I blue? Okay. You know, it would go with the motif, right? So it's just, right. So basically now what happens is you guys feel the absence, right? That's what's called negative pressure. And that creates an impetus in you guys to fill in that negative pressure. Pressure always goes from positive to negative. That is to say, you always try to fill an empty space. This is the reason why we will blow up in space, is because our pressure seeks to fill in the negative pressure, the vacuum of space, which in that process means that we just blow up. That's I would be on not very pretty, but that's what would happen. We're trying to fill that void. And so every time you get this negative space, right? So I'm gone now. There's this negative hole here. The water column now sees this and says like, but we got to fill that hole. And so what happens is you guys fill the hole and pull the column up. So you have two things. You have the capillary action, and then you also have this motive drive to keep replacing the next guy who evapotranspirates. So it's your turn next. And then when you leave, then Jared has to fill in your spot, and then he pulls the column up and so forth. And that's basically how you kind of keep this treadmill thing going. Make sense? Wow, that is a powerful throw. It's a little wide right. Next time, aim right here. But that was a wicked slider, though. I like that. And had some serious break right there at the end. So this is just kind of refresh your memory, right? So we got the structure of water, where you can form the hydrogen bonds because you have the negative and the positive relationship. And of course, you can also form hydrogen bonds with non-water molecules, right? So an organic molecule that happens to be polar, so they have to be polar typically. And so the negatives will surround the positives and basically create this hydrogen bond. So you can do it in both situations. So, okay. So that is cohesion, adhesion, and surface tension. Now there's a trio that I want to talk about that are kind of like related to energy. So the first one is specific heat. The next one is the heat of vaporization. And then we have the idea that the solid is less dense than the liquid. Okay, so first of all, before we get to specific heat, let me define what specific heat is, and we'll talk a little bit about it. So specific heat is the amount of energy, usually heat, needed to raise 1 gram of substance 1 degree C. Okay, that's all well and good. But what does that mean exactly? Well, let's take a look at it. So what I want to do is, and a lot of times students will be like, okay, specific heat, that's great. It means nothing to me. And, oh, is that a question? I can see the hand starting to turn blue because it's like the blood's running out of it. Oh yeah, there's all sorts of electrical current. There's an entire like discipline, subdiscipline, physiological and electrophysiology. And a lot of times the electrical charge is not so much created by water per se, because water is even balance, that's what positive and negative, but oftentimes because of the disproportionate distribution of ions within that water flow. So anywhere you kind of get a disproportionate pile up of ions, positive or negative, you're creating charge disparity, which is electrostatic. In general, not specifically, it's not like it's picking or choosing a tree to hit, but the idea of like, you know, the electrostatic charge thing, the balloon attracted to your head, or you shuffling across the carpet and zapping yourself, that's the same basic idea, right? So you're building up charge on yourself because you're picking up electrons from the carpet. And then there's a charge disparity between you and the metal handle. And so if that gets big enough, that disparity is big enough, then what will happen is it'll arc and you'll get a flow of electrons, what lighting is, like pure current. And then that'll even out the charge. That's the reason why you don't keep zapping yourself, is because that equilibrates and then the charge gets equalized and then you're good. Now, lightning is the exact same set of physics at a larger scale. In this case, what's happening is 2 clouds are rubbing up against each other and getting charged near the lopsided charge distribution. And if it builds up big enough, then you'll get an arc. And the same thing's happening between the clouds and the Earth. So if you kind of get a disparity of charge between the atmosphere and the Earth, then you'll get a ground to cloud strike as opposed to a cloud to cloud strike. Those are rarer. So the ground to cloud strikes are rarer than the cloud to cloud. Most of what we see in thunderstorms and things like that are cloud to cloud. But yeah, I mean, if you're stupid enough to, go out on the top of, now it is true though, like, I mean, and this is like, those of you hikers, if you like to hike above tree line, you always have to watch the weather, right? Because it's one of the reasons why you always want to start off in the morning, right? Because you want to get at your peak early, because the thunderstorms will start to roll in around 2, 3 o'clock in the morning. And if you're in the afternoon, which means if you're stupid enough to be out there on a bare rocky outcrop, when some of that charge disparity starts to build in the atmosphere, I mean, you might as well, I mean, that's not a good situation, right? So that's the reason why, everybody's like, yeah, you need to get down, right? So that you're not the highest thing, because it strikes the first thing it sees. So if you're higher than everything else around you because you're above tree line, hello, right? Lightning rod. You're a walking lightning rod, right? That's basically what that is. And it's particularly bad in certain areas. I know in California, if you are like, on El Capitan or Half Moon, Half Dome or something like that, those like really, they're elevated and they're just bare and stark rocky outcrops. It's really dangerous up there when thunderstorms start to roll in, because you're literally like a lightning rod up there. And that's pretty dangerous. There's a lot of people who get struck by lightning up there because they don't pay attention and they don't get down soon enough. So. Yeah, you don't have to be struck by lightning to feel it, because you'll actually feel like all the hair stand up. And like, there's actually some really good videos of soccer players. There's actually a couple, like a few years ago, actually, it happened. There's a lightning strike on a soccer field during a game, and it didn't hit anybody. It just like hit maybe, 50 yards away from the player, and it was enough to knock those players all on the ground. I'd have to find it. Yeah, I probably to like Google, like, soccer field lightning strike or something like that. It was like pretty, I mean, it's like everybody was like knocked unconscious. That's, yeah. It's some areas, golf courses, because you're like, largely most golf courses are fairly flat, except for the fools that are raising their metal golf clubs. Hello, lightning rod. Yeah, so that happens a lot on golf courses too. Yeah. Yeah. This, you mean thunder, you mean? Yeah. Yeah. Well, no, the thing with a lightning strike, if you get struck by lightning, you won't see it coming. You won't hear it coming, because the electricity is moving faster than the speed of sound. So you'll hear nothing. But then later on, you'll hear the decompression of the air around it. And those sound waves are what we hear as thunder. So what happens is actually air itself is like an insulator, right? And so you can maintain charge. We do this all the time in electricity, right? So we kind of build up charge in a capacitor, right? It's kind of like a temporary storage silo for electricity, so that we can deploy it sort of evenly as opposed to like erratically. So we use this idea all the time. And so you can store charge actually as long as you have an insulator. The insulator is what keeps the arc from occurring. And there's some insulators that are really good, and there's some insulators that are not so good. And so there is a point at which, a physics point, at which that insulator no longer has the capacity to hold that disparity anymore because it's just too big. And that's what's called a dielectric moment. Okay. And what happens with lightning is that moment, it breaks down, and literally the lightning basically sort of overcomes the insulating effects of the air. And as it does so, it actually pushes the air out of the way in a massive sort of a way as it sort of starts to flow. Well, that creates something that's very similar to tsunami waves, only in air. And so what you see is this initial like massive disturbance of air waves that then ripples throughout the atmosphere. And that's what we hear as thunder.
I heard the tsunamis, people always talk about how it's like you try to surf them, but the wave of tsunami never breaks, right?
Not really. I mean, a tsunami is actually not a good wave. It's not like like a good surfing wave because it doesn't crest like that. What a tsunami does is it's more like a storm surge. So a tsunami is more like a wave that's so big that it doesn't ever get big enough, because in order to crest, you have to get like so big that gravity overcomes your peak and starts to pull you over. That never happens, right? What happens is you're so big that as you hit ground, you start to lean forward, and then you just basically start to invade land. So it's like the surf coming in, only it just keeps coming and keeps coming and keeps coming because the wave itself is long. It's still, most of that energy of the wave is still out in the sea. And so all that has to come in and is pushing all that water onto the land until it's over. And then once that wave actually makes land, it'll basically come back. So it's a lot more kind of like a normal surf, like a storm surge, right? Storm surge doesn't crest either. It just comes in, right? It just sort of like starts coming for you. It's like a backed up toilet, right? I mean, it just doesn't stop coming, right? And your plunger's not going to help. You just run for your life in this case, right? What? Yeah, most of our tsunami or tidal wave movies are not accurate. Okay. Which is the general, like the big giant surf wave look. It's like, oh my gosh, here it comes. Like Armageddon is another one that I love, right? They're standing there waiting. It's like, it doesn't look like that. No. Which one? Oh, cool. I'll have to watch that one. I like sharks. Okay. So what exactly, that was a nice interlude, a helpful one, right? Because that explains a lot. But what exactly is specific heat? Well, specific heat, we already defined that, but that still doesn't help, right? It's like, okay, that's great. So the amount of heat to change, blah, 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 right? I mean, that's kind of where it's all coming. It's like the Charlie Brown teacher. Wah, 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 wah. Probably like the entire semester for you guys. But anyway, so what exactly is specific heat? So what I want to do is I want to illustrate specific heat by giving you guys kind of a little bit of an example. So here's what I want you guys to do. So what I want you guys to do is I want you to essentially take a shovel, okay? And I want you to go somewhere where there's actually hot weather, not Denver. All right, so pick one. I'm looking at you, desert fans. Yes. Oh, yeah, it does. This is one supposed to be muted, but I don't think this one is. Let me just check to make sure. Did I get muted? No, this one's live. This one should be muted. Oh, I got unmuted is what it is. No, that's muted. Okay, that's good. So this one should be muted. This one should not be. Good. Okay. Thank you, Zoom. Right, Zoom is always very on top of things like that. Okay, so here's what we're gonna do. Let's pick a hot spot. Are we going to Denver? It doesn't get hot in Denver. I'm sorry, it doesn't get hot. Let's do, no, it doesn't really get hot enough in Vegas for me. Okay, now you're getting serious, right? So now you're like, okay, let's leave the country. Let's go where people go to die, right? That's like the Sahara, right? So if you want to stay local, I mean, you could do local, right? So you could do places like what? Mojave. Death Valley, that's my favorite. Right? They don't call it Death Valley to be cute. Right? I mean, literally, you'll die there. I mean, like the whole thing about like having car trouble in Death Valley, and that's like a life and death moment. That's like no joke. That's actually real. Because if you don't get out of that desert, you're screwed. Right? I mean, we're talking about places where it gets up to like 150. Okay. We are barely getting to 100. We might get to 100, maybe once in a summer. Go 50 more, right? So we're talking about bone crushing heat here. Now, here's what I want you to do. I want you to go out there. I want you to put a shovel out there. Just lay down on the ground. And then I want you to retreat in the nice air conditioned confines of your favorite establishment. And drink your favorite drink. Eat, drink, and be merry, right? Just enjoy life. And then what I want you to do is I want you at the apex of the heat of the day, like 4 o'clock in the afternoon, when things are suffering at Death Valley. I want you to go out there and I want you to pick up the shovel. What do you grab? Okay. Okay, so you grab gloves. So what part of the shovel do you grab? Gloves? Gloves are cheating, no gloves.
The wooden handle.
So the wooden handle, right? Plastic handle, perhaps, right? Why aren't you going to grab the spade? What is it made out of? Yeah, right. So here's the thing. Obviously, two very different experiences, yes? By the way, if you haven't lived in that sort of heat, it doesn't actually take 150 to get to that place. You can actually do that like in 106 or so. It is true, you can actually create a burn bad enough to send you to the emergency room if you were to touch metal like that. It's been out there in that heat.
Does sand versus the sand would be hotter?
I think it depends on the concrete. If the concrete is dark, it could be hotter. If the sand is darker, it could be hotter because it's absorbing more energy, right? That's just the absorption of dark and light stuff. We all know that, right? So you don't wear dark clothes in the summer, right? You wear light clothes in the summer. That's why t-shirts are a big deal, right? So that's a thing, but it depends, right? It completely depends. Here's the problem with that. It's like 6 and 1/2 dozen of the other. I mean, I would argue the sand would be worse because you can kind of do like the little hot-footed lizard dance on the pavement. You can't do that on sand. Not only that, but the hot sand, as your foot sinks into the sand, your foot will basically be covered by the sand, which will essentially bake your foot. So it's like putting your foot into an oven as opposed to walking on a frying pan. I don't know. You pick how you want to burn your foot, right? At the end of the day, it doesn't really matter. But here's the thing, right? Like,
So with animals that like, not, there's probably not a lot, but there's like certain, I think like lizards that can run on sand like that hot.
got a screen crash here. Okay. So what you're experiencing when you touch the metal, hopefully not, or the wood, is an example of specific heat. So specific heat is a specific version of a broader topic in chemistry called heat capacity, right, which is defined similarly. That is to say, different substances have the ability to absorb energy without changing temperature. Now, what does this mean for the purpose of water? Well, what this means for the purpose of water, if it has a high specific heat, it means it can absorb a lot of energy without changing temperature, without changing a degree C. Exactly, right? And that's exactly the example that I'm heading toward. I did this yesterday with moderate success. You would think that I'd be able to draw my home state a little bit better than I do.
Have you heard of Dubai, Ethiopia?
No, is that like the hottest place on earth?
Yeah, I'd say that's up there, yeah. The hottest inhabited place.
Okay. So what did I just draw?
Maybe California?
Yeah, the top looks good. The top looks good. You can tell I'm a Northern Californian, right? Because I get the top, I even get the Bay Area right. So you can see the Northern Peninsula, the Southern Peninsula, the Golden Gate's right here. Here's the Bay. The Bay Bridge goes here. Here's San Pablo Bay. So this part here, once I get down here, it's like, Southern California, screw it. They're all the same.
San Diego.
Yeah, so I don't really care. I was a Northern kid, so I can't stand Southern Californians. It's funny because, Coloradans are like, those darn Californians are coming here. It's like, most of them are Southern Californians that you hate because honestly, Northern Californians, I kind of agree with you. They're coming north too, and that kind of pisses us off. So, yeah. So usually most Coloradans don't even realize that they're talking to a Northern Californian. It's the Southern Californians that usually are causing the problems. Those are the ones that are coming in with all their entitlement, and it's like, that kind of crap. So, yeah, there's a reason why I left. So, and I didn't leave as a kid. I left as an adult, so I had enough. Okay, so what's right here? Well, actually, we're looking at the basin,
Well.
right? So this is LA Basin, right? That's about when you kind of break in that little carved in section, right? Now, if I draw this better, I have to go a little further south. San Diego's a little further south here, so it probably needs to go down a little bit more like this and be a little less crazy looking. So anyway, I'm not going to mess with that. That's it. Who cares, right? So what are the temperatures like in LA on average? 80s-ish on average, right? So that's pretty nice, right? Pretty balmy. So what does it look like when you start to move inland? Not very far, by the way. Yeah. Ever heard of Palm Springs? How hot does it get in Palm Springs? Yeah, hundreds. Where are the deserts, by the way? They're right here in the south. So it's not very far. You don't have to drive very far from LA, nice and temperate, before you start getting to bone crushing. But,
Santa Barbara. It's like 60 degrees.
So Santa Barbara is actually the best kept secret in California. Probably the only place I would go back to if I went back to California. It's in Southern California, which is unfortunate. However, it's absolutely beautiful there. And it's shielded from the armpit of LA. The unwashed armpit of LA. Yes, I'm a Northern Californian, and I say that knowing that. But it's nicely shielded by the Santa Monicas. By the way, in the same area is where all the rich people live, Beverly Hills. That's kind of where all the richies live. And so just a little on the Santa Monica Mountains, which is a coastal strand of mountains, you have Santa Barbara. So it's kind of shielded from the riffraff of LA. This northern area of LA, that's kind of where UCLA is, in that area, the Westwood area. But otherwise, other than that, avoid LA. It's just a pit. Yeah, it's basically, LA is a city that basically has spun out of control. San Diego's better, much better than LA. Yeah, LA is, yeah. They've also got a great naval port, actually. Let's go to another city that I hate equally. How about this guy right here? Yeah, right, that's the Bay Area. So you got San Fran on the southern peninsula, right? You got Marin on the northern peninsula. That's where Robin Williams lived. That's where rich people live, is in Marin County. And then, of course, me over here, when I was a kid, on the East Bay, slumming it in Oakland, actually just a little north of Oakland. So as an East Bay kid, you grow up hating West Bay, right? So Oakland and San Francisco are very much at odds with each other. Yeah, well, yes, that's because the Warriors are the only thing in town. So the West Bay people have no choice unless they want to just check out of the sport altogether. But the Warriors are East Bay. They're ours. They're Oakland. So they belong to us. But that's the reason why, you know, as a Bay Area kid, one of the things you'll notice about me is I absolutely hate San Francisco and everything about West Bay. That's because I hate East Bay too, because I just don't like being killed and robbed all the time. But I hate the West Bay. So like that trickles everywhere. As a Raider fan, I hate the Niners more than even the Chiefs. The Chiefs I can handle, I can live with winning. I cannot tolerate when the Niners win, like at all. That's my East Bay, West Bay thing coming out. So it's just like New York, right? Where you have the different New Yorkers kind of at each other's throats. It's the same thing. What? Yeah. Yeah, right. So I mean, you have these rivalries, right? You have North and South Chicago. You have these different kind of rivalries and things like that. For this area, it's East Bay, West Bay. I'm an East Bay kid, so I'm not on the rich side. You have to make a lot more money than what I make now to actually live on the San Francisco Peninsula. That's just not happening. So what's the temperatures like here in the Bay Area? '70s being generous. That's being too generous. Yeah, but if a San Franciscan sees 80 degrees, they are whining. They do whine, actually. I mean, you just want to stuff a sock in them. That's just, you know, suck it up. I mean, honestly, it's like the privileged. It's like, whatever. You privileged South Peninsulas. I mean, try living over here. Try living just north of Oakland and living to tell about it, right? So yeah, not a little bitterness there still, right? And I was in grade school, by the way, when I was there. So it's like, that's how long this sort of has lasted. Those memories were embossed, right, tattooed on my brain. Okay, so we're looking at probably something more like 60s. Oh yeah, by the way, you notice I didn't say 60s, and you're probably thinking, well, when? That's it, like all year round. Like there is no such thing as winter. It's 60s plus or minus 5 degrees all year round. You don't see snow coats like parkas and things like that we see that are just like normal life here in Denver. You don't see those actually in stores anywhere in the Bay Area. They're not needed. Light windbreaker, maybe? Like, just to give you a Bella's coat, which is a smaller version of like, you know, would be like way overkill for San Francisco. A hoodie, maybe, kind of what Crystal's got on. That's about it. That's all you need. Okay, now let's go inland. Maybe about an hour and a half. What city we run into? Yeah, Sacramento, right? The city that I moved to from the Bay Area. Go Kings. Please stop embarrassing us. But anyway, right? So what does it get like in Sacramento? Yeah, right. So basically, I can tell you right now, in the winter, Sacramento gets maybe five, and that's being generous, 5 frost days. Frost days, not snow days, frost days. And it's not like the hard frost, right? I mean, it's like the light frost. If it snowed, they probably would. Yeah. So it never snows there. In the spring, you get your rainy season. And boy, does it come for you, right? I mean, entire towns disappear during the rainy season in this area. Levees break, rivers overflood. Marysville, like right before I moved out here to the Midwest, actually disappeared that March. So the levee broke, and then the entire city of Marysville was gone, completely flooded. Yeah, and it happens periodically. So that's what happens. But then guess what? That's in the spring. That's in the March, right? When we're enjoying our spring thaw, we're getting all excited here in Denver because the crocuses are coming out and the tulips are coming out. We can smell spring on the air. We're getting excited for summer. In Sacramento, they're swimming for their life, right? And then when we're getting settled into a good long season of Rockies baseball, hopefully a productive season of Rockies baseball, and say about May or so, all of a sudden the rain stops like an act of God. The heat sets in. I mean, literally, it's like that. I mean, just like literally shuts off, like there's a famine on the way, like we did something wrong, and like all the deities we didn't sacrifice enough animals, right, to all the the weather gods. And all of a sudden the heat sets in right around Memorial Day. And by what I mean by heat is I mean like in the hundreds routinely, and that lasts until September. No, there's no rain at all in the summer in Sacramento. It actually dries completely up. In the summer, there's no rain at all. You can go an entire month or more without seeing a single cloud in the sky. All you have is 106 degrees, a bare sun, and no relief. The next day, you get the same. And the next day, you get the same. And the next day, you get the same. And the next day, you get the same. So when we're breaking records in Sacramento, it's because temperatures are soaring habitually, routinely over 100 degrees. In Denver, we're whining when it hits 90. So here's the question. All you did was drive an hour and a half inland. How come all of a sudden now you've got the extreme?
The ocean is in Sacramento.
Exactly, right? By the way, the entire Central Valley is hot. So it gets hot in the entire Central Valley. There's nowhere to run, okay? As a matter of fact, that's the reason why most of Californians live on the coast, is because of the coolness. Now, the reason is because of the Pacific Ocean, right? You've got this giant heat sink here. So what happens is all that beat down sun is going to be hitting this particular area of the state. Then all that solar radiation is going to get absorbed by the water. Why? Because it has a high heat, specific heat, and it's not going to change temperature. That keeps the coastal temperatures relatively temperate. But as you start to move inland, you start to lose some of that coverage of the Pacific Ocean effect, and you start to it's you and the sun, baby, right? So that's it, right? And that's basically what you get. You get that really hot Central Valley. And not only that, but it's not humid at all. It's dry. It's not as dry as Denver, but it's pretty darn dry in Sacramento. That's why everything in the summer dies. Everything's brown and dead during the summer. There's no clouds in the sky during the summer. There's no rain during the summer. There's nothing. That's pretty harsh.
Where's San Jose?
San Jose's in the Bay Area. It's in the southern end of the Bay Area. So it's kind of like in this area down here. Like there's Palo Alto on the western side, San Jose is on the eastern side. Go Sharks. Right. You know, I think we need a class field trip, right? So a field trip to California. We need to go check all this stuff out. You know, I think I can make a case. I think I can make a case there. Right? So that's specific heat. Now, what does this do for us, right? Biologically speaking, well, what this does for you is it gives you zones of habitation, right? Zones of habitat. So for instance, right in here, you have coastal mountains, which are cool. And this is where a lot of people live, right? So this is kind of the southern end of this would be Santa Barbara. The northern end, this is where you'd find places like Santa Cruz, Monterey, San Luis Obispo, Carmel, right? That's where Clint Eastwood was, Pebble Beach, right? That's where these areas are, in these kind of cool coastal mountains areas. And so there's certain organisms that can live there. Some organisms would rather prefer the heat of the valley. So they're more grass feeders. So this is a really huge grassland type of an area in California. And so like if you're an herbivore and you're kind of into the whole grazing thing, by the way, that doesn't exist anymore here. It's all mechanized farming. So don't expect to go there and find like, you know, like what we see out here in the Midwest, like grasslands. That doesn't exist because we've largely screwed it all up basically. But you get a little hotter if you want mountains. You've got both the Sierra and the Cascade that you can go to. As you go a little further north, your redwoods are right up here, which get a massive amount of rainfall, by the way. It's actually the only place that's defined atmospherically as a rainforest. So it gets so much rainfall that it's actually technically categorized as a rainforest, as a temperate rainforest. Every other rainforest is subtropical and tropical, right? So this is the only example that I know of an actual temperate rainforest is in the redwoods because it gets so much moisture. Well, the redwoods are there because the moisture. That's where the moisture stops. And as a matter of fact, if you take a look at the Cascades, it's also another cool one. Like drive through the Sierra, right? The Sierra are a very dry mountain range. There's a lot of fire hazards there, but it's a habitually dry mountain range. But as you get into the Cascades, it's a very wet. There's a lot more lushness. There's a lot more greenery. You can see there's more moisture in the Cascades. The Cascades begin here and they go all the way through Oregon and all the way up into Washington. So all those like beautiful mountains we see in Washington, like Rainier and things of that nature, those are all part of the Cascade. And so that lush greenery of Oregon is what the Cascades are like. So the Cascades are a much wetter type of a version. The Sierra are much drier. They're actually drier than the Rockies. The Rockies are actually wetter than the Sierra. But the Sierra are also a lot more dangerous than the Rockies. The Rockies are easy. The Sierra are deadly. It's kind of funny because, you know, it snows in the mountains here and we go ski on the slopes and it's all fun and games, and avalanches are a big issue here, right? But when you actually go to the Sierra, like during the winter, entire towns disappear in the winter. Like a lot of people don't realize that, but right in around here, around Tahoe, you have Truckee on the north, and then right up in here is where the Cascades take over. That's some of the heaviest snow in the lower 48 that happens there. As a matter of fact, you may not realize this, but Truckee actually continually every year disappears under like 12 plus feet of snow. It was kind of a truck stop. It's kind of like a way station that's right around Tahoe on your way from Sacramento to Reno. And so that's part of why it is. It's kind of an expanded version. It's bigger now than just a truck stop, but yeah, I mean, it completely disappears. It's the same area, by the way, where the Donner Party decided to have a little bit of a bite. You guys know the Donner Party story? Yeah, right. Where they all basically made a lot of poor decisions and they ended up eating each other.
Because they froze themselves.
Basically, yeah. As a matter of fact, you can actually go to this area. The Donner Memorial is actually just north of Truckee. You can actually go there to where the original Donner site is, and you can actually see where they cut the trees. You can see how high the snow was, and the trees are like 15 feet above the ground where they cut it. So that's how much snow was on the ground at that point. Think about that. 15 feet, that's crazy. But the Donner Party, yeah, it was one of those pioneer parties that was coming across the country, and they made a lot of bad decisions. They felt like they could make it over the Sierra, just like they did with the Rockies. But well, they were, but the problem is nobody really understood the mountain range, right? Because the Rockies are different than the Sierra, because the Rockies are individual mountains with deep valleys in between them. We know this because we have I-70 going through one of those valleys, right? And there's train stations, like if you ever take an Amtrak, it goes through the Glenwood Canyon. So there's low spots between the major mountain range areas where you can get through the Rockies. And that's what the Donners thought they were getting in the Sierra, but that's not true. The Sierra is like one giant granite block that's been uplifted 400 feet. So it's an impenetrable wall. So when they were thinking they were going to catch a valley, they were actually going over the mountain. That's the only way you could do that. And it wasn't a good idea. So
They left too late.
even today, one of the things, like if you're in the valley, just you do not mess with Donner Pass. Don't mess with it, because during the winter, there are people who die there every year, even today in the 21st century, because they get trapped in their car, they get stuck in there, and then nothing good happens from there. So like even now, it's like, listen, this is closed. Donner Pass is closed, right? So we're not even going to let people in through here, because this is just ugly business. And that gets worse as you get up into this little northeast corner of California. So, but yeah, so the whole point of this has all been a nice little journey here, a little geography lesson, right? So you didn't know you're going to be learning geography, but now what's the point? Well, the point here is that the idea of specific heat creates different habitats within which different organisms can live and thrive. So if you don't like the cool temperate coast, go inland, heat it up a bit, right? If you don't like the snow of the north, go south, right? So there's somewhere for you to go, and that's basically given to you by the specific heat of water, the sort of temperature zoning effect. Okay, let's take a look at the heat of vaporization now. So the heat of vaporization is basically the heat at which a liquid turns to gas. So what is the heat of vaporization of water? The heat of vaporization of water, the point at which water turns into a gas. What? 200 what? Not Celsius. It is 200, but Fahrenheit. So what is it in Celsius? 100, right? What did you just give me here? What do we know this better as? The what? The boiling point of water, right? That's basically when water will start to turn into a gas, right? Technically speaking, it starts to vaporize sooner than that because we can see the steam coming off of it, right? So it's kind of in and around this particular range. But basically, this is the heat of vaporization. So it's a pretty high heat, right? That's basically what water has. So what does this do for us then? Well, first of all, what are you mostly made of? Yeah, you're mostly made of water, right? So here's what I want you to do here's what I want to do with you to kind of illustrate why this is an important sort of thing. I want to take two different liquids that have vastly different heat of vaporizations. Okay, the first one is water. We know that one well. And what I want you to do is I want you to put a couple of drops of water like on the lab bench. Okay. And then next to it, we're going to take a different chemical, different liquid, acetone. And we're going to put a couple of drops of that right next to the water droplet. Now, where would you find acetone? Like if I told you to go and get me some acetone and bring it back, where'd you come back with? Yeah, nail polish remover, right? So in some of these things, they have other things in there as well. It's not just straight acetone, but you can get straight acetone as well. Right? You can see the bottles of that as well. Okay, so here's what I want you to do. You got your two spots on the table, yes? Now what I want you guys to do is I want you to guys go and do lab for a couple of hours. And after a couple of hours, I want you to come back and tell me what you observed. Acetone is gone. Why?
It evaporates at a lower.
Yeah, right, because it has a lower heat of vaporization. It means that the liquid turns to a gas at a lower temperature. So the temperature at room temperature is usually between 20 and 22 degrees, somewhere in that range. And so what that basically means then is that the low heat of vaporization of acetone caused it to evaporate. How about the water? How's the water doing? Still there, right? Not a problem. So what do we have to do to get the water to evaporate? Yeah, right. So we have to heat that thing up.
Or spread it out.
spread it out so that it evaporates naturally. But a lot of times, if you're taking a look at that, right? So the question is water evaporating? Well, yeah, it is actually, but it's not evaporating because of the heat of vaporization. It's evaporating because of the disparity of the humidity in the air, right? So all water, just like pressures, want to go from high to low. So the idea is if you have a very arid climate, like you have in Denver in the winter, then the water will naturally want to try to moisten up that air, and that's what causes the water to evaporate at room temperature. It's trying to humidify, basically, and that's not the same thing, right? So we want to vaporize it at temperature. So here's the thing. So the acetone is what we call a volatile liquid, right? So it's basically a liquid that goes to a gas state very easily. And so here's what I want you to do, right? Because you haven't learned anything yet. I mean, you already knew what was going to happen to water. You already knew what was going to happen to acetone. You already came in the door with that, right? So you didn't actually add anything to your knowledge. You were just telling me what you already knew. So let's do something like this. Let's actually do a little bit of an experiment. Let's take a look at you. If you were to take all the water out of you, and instead of making you out of water, you made yourself out of acetone, what would you look like right now? Dead. Yes, but what would you look like if you were made out of acetone instead of water? What? Slimy? Be like a freeze-dried piece of beef jerky. So like a piece of beef jerky, right? Like freeze-dried, basically. Maximally dehydrated. Why? Because if you're made out of acetone, what's happening to you as you walk into the room? You're evaporating, right? And then your little husk is left over. Or little pieces of beef jerky walking around, right? So is that functional for us? No, right? We're basically lost in the atmosphere as a gas cloud, aren't we? So we can't do business that way, can we? Because remember, our chemical reactions have to be connected together so that we can have reactants in contact with each other. Is that going to happen in the acetone gas cloud? No. So we can't actually manage to keep acetone as a liquid long enough to be able to actually do any sort of significant chemistry. So what does water give us? The fact that water has a high heat of vaporization basically means we can come into a room temperature environment and not worry about evaporating. That means we can do chemistry, which means we can do biology, right? It also means, by the way, we can walk outside on a hot day and also not evaporate, which means we can do biological business. We can get ourselves really, really cold if we want to, right? And we still are going to have liquid, right? And we're going to be able to do chemistry. So what the heat of vaporization does is it gives us basically functional temperature range. Within which we can do biological work. So specific heat gives us more adaptation, more resilience to different types of temperatures, right? The heat of vaporization gives us temperature ranges with a broad temperature range, right, by the way, within which we can actually do biological work. We can actually get something functionally done on a biological scale. So that's a good thing, by the way. It's not a good thing to evaporate while you're trying to survive. That's usually a bad idea, right? So this basically ensures that we don't do that. Now, what about the solid? This business about the solid being less dense. So essentially, this right here is crazy talk. This is heresy. Why? Well, let me show you what most things do. What are the three states of matter? Solid, liquid, gas. So a gas basically is defined by random molecules just kind of pinging around the atmosphere, but they're far apart, yes? And as a result, we can't really get a lot done there because there's no consistent matrix within which we can get this done. Now, what happens if I start to cool this gas down? Basically, we start slowing down a little bit and we start kind of congealing together. We kind of start coming together a little bit, right? What that means then is that the atoms are closer together. They're still not super, super tight together, but they're closer together, which basically means they're denser. Right? That is to say you have more atoms per unit space. Okay. Now, what happens if we continue to cool the system down? So it turns into a solid, and these guys get really, really close. This is the densest. And most materials will do this, right? So let's imagine, and I want you to use an example of basically us. So let's say imagine that we're just kind of gas molecules. You cool us down into our liquid state. What most substances will do is they'll come in here and then they'll kind of get all kind of nice and cozy. Like you guys right now would be like liquid. You're close together. You're more dense than if I were to scatter you across the campus, right? And so, but you're still a lot of room here. Now, if I continue to cool you down to the point where you're going to become a solid, then that means we get even closer. So now we're going to get ourselves all in here, going to get all nice and cozy, right? So now we're all in here like shoulder to shoulder, and we actually get shoulder actually touching the shoulder. And most solids are okay with that. Like we'd be a solid, right? Like this is a solid, right? And we're good with that. But we're very dense, aren't we? Because we have a high number of atoms per unit space. That's what most materials do. Sure.
But if the molecules are getting closer together, then why is like an ice cube the same volume as water?
Yeah, I'll explain that. That's exactly where I'm going, right? That's the question we want to answer, right? In answering this idea. So because a solid is more dense than a liquid for all materials, the solid sinks and it's liquid. Everything on the planet does that. Its solid will sink in the liquid. Water is the only one where it doesn't do that. Why? Which is the answer to your question. Because water is a little bit different. Oh yeah, by the way, we do form a gas, right? Steam. And we're sort of pinging around, we're sort of spread out. And you can cool us down and we will start to form a liquid, right? So if we kind of come together, we're going to form a liquid just between ourselves. And you can continue to cool us down. But one thing that water starts to do is you start to cool it down to a freezing point, which is 0. It usually happens between like 0 and 4 degrees is usually when freezing is actually occurring. 4 degrees is usually the densest form of water, and that's your refrigerator. Basically, that's your refrigerator temperature. But what happens is, as we come together, like most solids are coming together, we're going to get shoulder to shoulder, right? But now what water does is instead, there's like a critical moment where the water molecules will get close together. Instead of going shoulder to shoulder, be okay with that. What water does is says, you know what? Too close. Personal. Right? And basically it pushes each other away and then kind of creates your little bubble, right? And if we're all doing that, then what that means is as we sort of come together initially as cold water, then once we get too close together, we expand because we're kind of doing the personal space thing. And that causes the ice to expand, which means it becomes less dense. There's fewer molecules per unit space. And if the density of any object is lower than its liquid, it will float.
Is that why pipes or like concrete crack when they freeze?
Yes, that's the reason why your water bottle in the freezer blows up. It's the reason why your pipes freeze, because the water in the pipe basically expands and it exceeds the strength of the pipe and splits it. It's also what happens when you do your driveway, right? That little crack gets a little bit of ice in there and the water expands and it basically creates a wedge, forcing that crack to be wider. And then the next season, it just gets wider and wider and wider, and pretty soon it'll break your concrete down into rubble. Okay, it's called that's what's called freeze fracture or freeze thaw weathering cycles. That's how we think rock actually weathers over time. Like a mountain becomes a pile of rubble. Okay, so That's all great and well and good. That'll get you a nice cup of lemonade in the summer with ice in it, floating with an acidic pH on a hot summer day because we're not next to the ocean. We don't have a specific heat variation. How many scientific concepts did I just throw into that scenario? Yeah, you got to love science, right? It's everywhere. You're drinking it, right? You're drinking it, you're eating it, you're breathing it. Okay, so this is a lake. It's a bad lake, but it's a lake. So in the winter, what's going to happen? Huh. I have no idea what that was. But anyway, it has something to do with this guy, not this guy. So in the winter, what's going to happen to that upper layer of water? Yeah, it's going to freeze, right? Now, if water was like anything else, no, you're not going to do remote. That's IT. So basically, if water was like everything else and the solids sank, what would happen to this layer of ice? Yeah, it'd go right down to the bottom, right? Just like everything else, right? You put solid iron and molten iron, it sinks before it melts and turns into molten iron itself. And then what's going to happen to the next layer of water? It'll freeze and then what? It'll sink, right? And then it'll freeze and then sink and then freeze and sink. And then eventually what do you got? Frozen solid, right? You can't support life with that. I mean, yeah, we have some bacteria in there, sure, right? But you can't really support a thriving ecosystem if it's frozen solid. Now, the way we have it with the ice floating is underneath, you got a lot of cold water, but you got a thriving ecosystem down there. How do you know that? Because we got entire areas of the world, like up in the northern latitudes, which do just that. I mean, they're covered by ice, but there's like an entire ecosystem going on down there, all sorts of stuff living down there. That wouldn't happen if ice didn't float. Okay. So that's the benefit of floating ice. It basically makes sure that even when we're frozen over, we still have a chance to live. Okay? It creates another habitat, yet one more area or zone that we might be able to fit. Remember, the name of the game is if I can throw enough options at you, maybe you might be able to adapt to one of them and thrive and survive and reproduce in them. Okay, that's the whole idea. Okay, so I don't like the cold, so this one doesn't help me. So I prefer it a little on the hot side. So Denver is probably right about the edge of my cold tolerance. But the heat is great. I mean, summer's like nice and cool here in Denver. So I love that piece of it, right? So it depends on what your habitat is, right? Different people thrive in different areas. And that's the same thing for all species. Different species thrive in different areas. The more options you have, the more life you can support. Okay, that's what water's doing for us. Now, number 5, so there's a 5 and a 6. So water is a solvent. So that's these guys here. And then number 6, which I want to unpack on the other slide, is the organizational power of water. Water. The organizational power of water. Okay, let's take a look at the idea of water as a solvent. So basically, in chemistry, you learn about solutions, right? And solutions have 2 parts to it. The first part is called the solute. This is basically what is dissolved. And the second part is the solvent, which is what is dissolving. So you have a dissolver and the dissolved. Water is our solvent. That basically means it forms the backdrop within which everything else is dissolved. So salt, for instance, is dissolved in water, right? So those polar molecules are dissolved in water. The reactants of your favorite chemical reaction that you need is dissolved in water. So this forms an entire spectrum of chemical reactions called aqueous or water containing reactions. So because we're mostly made of water, most of our chemical reactions are aqueous in nature. That means they need to be dissolved in water, which is the reason why we don't exist as a steam cloud, because the steam cloud isn't coherent enough, cohesive enough in order to support those chemical reactions. And we need that as a good solvent. And for the most part, as a good solvent, you basically will dissolve what is most like you, right? So when you take a look at solubility in chemistry, there's a mantra in chemistry called says like dissolves like, right? And that basically means that water being polar is able to dissolve other things that are polar and charged. Okay. Can it dissolve non-polar things? No. What happens when you mix oil and water? Yeah, the oil does nothing, right? It's like, don't touch me, right? So that is an example of like not dissolving something that is unlike it. Only like dissolves like. Now, this idea of unlike versus like, it gets to the organizational power of water. And so what I want, this is going to take a little bit of unpacking. There's a bit of an analogy associated with this. So there's a couple of points here that I really want to just drive home. That's important to drive it home now. And the more theatrical and crazy I can be, the better, because it'll help you to remember how theatrical and crazy I was. Hopefully you'll actually remember the nature of what's going on here. But we have to define, first of all, the relationship between these polar molecules led by their master water and the non-polars led by really not much of anybody. Okay. That relationship is going to be critical to understanding a lot of biology moving forward. So I don't want to end with this. I just want to give you guys a heads up. This is what I want to start with, right? Because I want to hit this one hard. I want to hit it deep, and I want to unpack it well. And it's going to take probably at least a good 10, 15 minutes to do that. Okay. And so this is where we're going to start. We're going to start with the organizational power of water next time. Now, for those of you who are wondering,